Okay, this is the video lesson for 10-3, the quadratic formula. So you are going to learn another method on how to solve a quadratic equation. This right here being what a quadratic equation looks like. Very important to remember that quadratic equations or quadratics are always in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c. That's the quadratic form. Obviously, a quadratic equation then equals 0 or equals, something. So, going to be very important also in this section to be able to identify what your A term, B term, and C terms are. You have to be able to do that to use the quadratic formula. So first of all, let's start out by just giving you the quadratic formula. This is something that you will just be given. You do not have to memorize it, although most people do. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. You know what? Now that I've written that once, I think I'm going to move it over to the side so I can write it bigger. Okay, so there you have it. There's your quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, minus 4ac all over 2a. Alright, so this is going to be what you use, the formula you can use, and plug those numbers in to figure out what x equals instead of using these other methods like factoring or completing the square. Okay, so you can do this to solve this equation without having to go through either of those other two methods that sometimes, takes more time. We're going to start this first problem here, and we're going to review all the methods just so you can see how they all produce the same answer. So, with this equation, x squared minus 2x minus 24, let's review how we would solve it using the factoring method. Well, using the factoring method, we would take 1 times negative 24, which gives me negative 24, and I'm going to find two numbers that multiply to make negative 24 and add to make negative 2. After maybe checking a couple things like 1 and 24, 2 and 12, hopefully you figure out that it is 4 and negative 6 that works. So positive 4 and negative 6. So now you can rewrite this equation and say x squared plus 4x minus 6x minus 24 equals 0. And you factor this by group factoring. The first group you're going to factor out an x, leaving you with x plus 4. The second group you factor out a negative 6, leaving you with x plus 4, still equals 0. So you now have x minus 6 times x plus 4 equals 0, which then means you would solve this by setting each piece equal to 0. X minus 6 equals 0 means x equals 6, and x plus 4 equals 0. Subtract 4 means x equals negative 4. So there are your two answers to this problem, x equals 6 and x equals negative 4. Okay, so that was one method we could use to solve these problems, was factoring. That's what we did all of Chapter 9, or Unit 9, was all about factoring to solve an equation. Now, so here in Unit 10, we then learned how to complete the square to solve an equation, because completing the square partly used factoring. So let's go ahead and take this same problem and solve it using completing the square, which again, you'll need to know how to do all these for the test anyway. So x squared minus 2x minus 24 equals 0. Again, this was the section that maybe was a little difficult because of all the steps that was involved. First step here is I would move my c value over to the other side, so I add 24 to both sides, giving me x squared minus 2x blank, because the 24 canceled, equals 0 plus 24 is 24. I then have to figure out what goes in that blank, and the process for figuring out what went in the blank was to divide this b term by 2. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1, and then squaring negative 1, which gives me positive 1. So positive 1 not only went right here, but also got added to the other side. So plus 1 here, plus 1 here, which turned this equation into x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 25. So there you completed the square, which then meant after you completed the square, you would have to factor this trinomial, which is now a perfect square, so it factors into x minus 1 squared equals 25. And then you would square root both sides. So you would get x minus 1 equals plus or minus 5. Then meaning to solve, you would add 1 to both sides, giving you x equals positive 1 plus or minus 5, which, since this was a whole number, 1 plus 5 is 6, and 1 minus 5 is negative 4. So, got the same two answers as we did using the factoring form. And we will talk a little bit here in this set of notes. Actually, the next page notes, you're going to get a little table there that will talk about when's the best time to use each method. And just a little heads up, best time to use a factoring method is when it does factor nice and evenly like it did in this problem. This problem would be one that I probably use factoring to do. When's the best time to use completing the square is going to be when you already have a perfect square trinomial created. If that's already a perfect square trinomial, so I don't have to go through all this process of creating a perfect square trinomial. And then when's the best time to use quadratic formula is pretty much about any time. You can use a quadratic formula for any problem, but you'd have to use the quadratic formula if the answers aren't going to come out to be whole numbers, because this is going to be the easiest way to get the answer if it's not going to end up being whole numbers. So let's practice the quadratic formula here. So first thing I want you to do with the quadratic formula is you need to identify what the a value is, what the b value is, and what the c value is of this original equation, x squared minus 2x minus 24 equals 0. And again, that should not be too difficult to do. You're just looking for the numbers. A is 1, B is negative 2, and C is negative 24. So now that you've identified what A, B, and C is, all you're going to do is plug those numbers in. Plug those numbers in to that equation. Okay? So, let me see. Let's just write it out. You got the equation up there, so let's just write it out. We have x equals, now, negative b means I want the opposite sign. I want the opposite of what b is. Negative means opposite, right? So negative b means the opposite of b. If b is negative 2, the opposite of negative 2 is positive 2. So x equals positive 2. Then I have plus or minus the square root of b squared, which for b squared I'm going to just go ahead and write negative 2 in parentheses squared, because b is negative 2, so I have negative 2 squared, minus 4 times a, which a is 1, times c, and c is negative 24. And then all of this, all of it, write your fraction bar all the way across this, all of this gets divided by 2 times a, which again in this case a is 1. So there you go. All you've done is plugged in a, b, and c into the quadratic formula, and now you can simplify. So let's simplify this. I'm going to have x equals, obviously, 2 plus or minus, and I'm going to simplify this kind of piece at a time. What is negative 2 squared? Well, that's positive 4. And then I'm going to do this part right here. I'm going to take negative 4 times 1 times negative 24. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4 times negative 24 is positive 96. Right? So I have 4 plus 96 underneath the radical. All over 2 times 1, which is 2. Okay? Now, next step, just moving over another one. Just like I moved over here, I have x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of, well, what is 4 plus 96? That's 100, all divided by 2. Next step, what is the square root of 100? Well, that's 10, right? So I'm going to have x equals 2 plus or minus 10 all over 2. And now again, at this point, this is where you just give me your final answers to the problem, which we already know, but this is where you say, okay, well, what is 2 plus 10? Well, that's 12, and I'm going to just bring this up. You know what, I'm just going to erase the original part here, and you can look at the, so I can show this over here. So, I'm going to bring this in blue back over to here. So, 2 plus 10 is 12, and 12 divided by 2 is 6. So that's my one answer, x equals 6. The other answer is 2 minus 10, and 2 minus 10 is negative 8, and negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. Again, the same two answers as we got for either of the other two methods that we used. So the nice thing about the quadratic formula is that it's just kind of plug and chug. Plug in A, B, and C, and then solve out the problem, and you'll get your final your two answers. A lot of people like this the best because it's just straightforward. All right, let's move on to 2 more examples and see what happens in those. Okay, so here's number 2 and 3, just 2 pretty straightforward examples on using the quadratic formula. There are a couple tricks for each of those. So looking at number 2 here, the first trick is that before you can identify what your A, B, and C is, before you can do that, this equation has to be correctly written in ax squared plus bx plus c form, meaning equals 0. And this problem starting out here is not. And again, it's not because of this 4 is on the other side of the equation. So I'm going to first subtract this 4 back over to the left side of the equation. So my new equation says 15x squared minus 8x minus 4 equals 0, which then allows me to pretty easily here identify my A, B, and C, right? A is 15, B is negative 8, and C is negative 4. Okay? So, again, now we're just going to plug it in. Plug it into the quadratic formula, which I've rewritten above here, which you already have at the top of your notes page. So let's just go to it. My first thing here is negative b. Negative b means the opposite of what b is. If b is negative 8, negative b is positive 8, right? So I have x equals positive 8 plus or minus the square root of b squared. Well, what is negative 8 squared? I'm going to maybe skip a step here. Negative 8 squared is positive 64. Then I have minus 4 times a times c. Now don't skip this step at all. Make sure you write this out. So negative 4 times a, well, a is 15, and times c, and c is negative 4. And then this is all divided by 2 times a, so 2 times 15. So, a little bit more complicated simplifying here, just because the numbers are a little bit bigger, but it shouldn't be too difficult here. We say x equals 8 plus or minus the square root of 64, and then we're going to take negative 4 times 15 times negative 4. Do that on your calculator if you have to. Bottom line is you should be coming up with positive 240. And then this is all over 2 times 15, easy enough, 30. Next step, just add together what's underneath the radical. So we now have 8 plus or minus the square root of 304 all over 30. Now, this is where what we've learned in the previous chapters or the previous sections comes into play, because you're not going to leave the square root of 304 like it is. You are going to simplify the square root of 304. Now, this might take a little bit of time because of how large it is, but I'm just going to use my factor tree method. 2 times 152. 152 is 2 times 76. 76 is 2 times, what is that, 38. So we got 2 and 38, and then finally 38 is 2 and 19, and that's where I can finally stop because 19 is prime. So now, how does this simplify? Well, remember what we did. We said we got a pair of 2's, comes out as a 2. Another pair of 2's comes out as a 2. And 19 didn't have a pair. So I'm ending up here with 4 square root of 19. So I'm going to rewrite this as x equals 8 plus or minus. And then instead of saying the square root of 304, I'm going to say 4 root 19 all over 30. Now, again, we're talking a lot about simplification here, simplifying things down, and this is not simplified all the way yet, and that's because this is still a fraction, right? And if this fraction, if all 3 of these numbers can be reduced by the same amount, they need to be reduced by the same amount. Only if all 3 can. Because again, 30 sits underneath the 8 and underneath the 4 root 19. So if all 3 of these whole numbers can be simplified like a fraction, simplify them. So final answer here, I'll just write it next to our problem here, is x equals 8, 4, and 30 are all divisible by 2, correct? So 8 divided by 2 is 4. Plus or minus 4 divided by 2 is 2. Square root of 19. You never mess with what's underneath the square root sign. And then this is all over 15. So there is your final answer. And same as in the last section, you do have to tell me what this is approximately equal to so that I can graph this if I need to. Again, we're rounding to the nearest tenths, and this is all calculator work. Type this into your calculator. 4 plus 2 root 19. Get that answer, divide it by 15. You should be coming up with the two rounded off answers of 0.8 and negative 0.3 for your two rounded off answers for that problem. All right, very good. So, we have one more example here of just using the quadratic formula. You should be able to do this on your own now. So go ahead and attempt this one on your own. It is set up already. Should set up perfectly here for you to tell me what is your A. Well, A is 2. What is your B? B is 9. And what is your C? C is 4, right? So, because it already says equals 0, which we know when we're solving, we have to have it equal to 0 when we solve here. So, plug in those A's, B's, and C's, and then unpause the video and see if you've done that right. All right, boom, there it is. Did you get it filled in correctly? The only thing I'm concerned about you getting it filled in correctly is, did you take negative B, the opposite of B? B was 9, so you have to write negative 9. And did you correctly square B? 9 squared is positive 81. Other than that, you're just plugging numbers into positions. Okay? So now we'll go ahead and start simplifying. X equals negative 9 plus or minus square root of 81, and then negative 4 times 2 times 4 is negative 32. And again, I got that by taking negative 4 times 2 times 4. Just always think of that as a negative 4, and then whatever your number is that's what it is, negative 32. So I got 81 minus 32. And this is all over 2 times 2, which is 4. So keep simplifying. Negative x equals negative 9 plus or minus 81 minus 32 is 49. So square root of 49 all over 4. Now, unlike the last problem where I had, the square root of 304, which is not a perfect square, obviously, that's why I ended up with, this estimated answer after I gave the square root answer, the radical answer. On this one, since I know the square root of 49 is a perfect square, I know I'm going to get, real numbers. I'm not going to get any roots. So, next step means x equals negative 9 plus or minus 7 all over 4, and then you can give me your two actual answers. And your two actual answers come from just writing that out, right? Negative 9 plus 7 is negative 2 over 4, which is negative 1/2, right? So there's your first answer, negative 1/2. X equals negative 1/2. Second answer, negative 9 minus 7, which is negative 16. And negative 16 divided by 4 is negative 4. Second answer. So negative 1/2 and negative 4 are the two answers for x. Okay, now one rule I want you to add up here at the top right or somewhere on this page, maybe for you it's at the bottom of the page. Big important rule I want you to add up here, and that is if you have a negative square root, meaning you have a negative number underneath your radical sign, your answer is no solution. There is no solution to that because you know you can't have a negative square root. So if this would have said the square root of negative 49 right down here, the square root of negative 49, you'd have had no solution. You wouldn't have had to go any farther, just say no solution, because you can't do the square root of a negative number. You get error on your calculator, and that's not possible. So, all right, there you have it. Those are all of your examples. Once again, I'm going to break this up into a two-part section, a two-part video. That right there pretty much explains how to use the quadratic formula, but there are a few other things we need to do or need to understand about the quadratic formula. So next video will be the second part of these notes.